Socrates. Let's kick things off with the OG of Greek philosophy, Socrates. Now, if you've ever been told that asking too many questions is annoying, Socrates would have disagreed. In fact, he made a whole career out of it. Socrates didn't write books, he didn't build schools, he didn't even leave behind a single scroll. What he did leave was a way of thinking that changed everything. Born around 470 BCE in Athens, Socrates was a strange figure even in his own time. He wandered the streets barefoot, talking to anyone who'd listen or argue. He wasn't rich, he wasn't flashy, and he didn't care about status. What he cared about was truth, and he believed the only way to get there was through conversation. That's where the Socratic method comes in. It's not a lecture, it's not a debate, it's a dialogue, a series of questions designed to peel back assumptions and expose contradictions. Socrates would ask someone a simple question like, "What is justice?" The person would answer, and Socrates would follow up with another question, then another, and another, until the person realized their definition didn't hold up. It wasn't about winning, it was about clarity. Socrates believed that most people walk around thinking they know things, but they don't. And the first step toward wisdom is admitting that. That's why he said, "I know that I know nothing." It wasn't self-deprecating, it was honest. He saw ignorance not as a flaw, but as a starting point. He applied this method everywhere, to ethics, politics, love, courage. He didn't give people answers. He helped them find their own, and that made him dangerous. In the city like Athens, where tradition and pride ran deep, Socrates' constant questioning rubbed people the wrong way. He challenged authority. He made powerful men look foolish, and he inspired young people to think for themselves. Eventually, that got him into trouble. In 399 BCE, Socrates was put on trial for corrupting the youth and impiety, basically for asking too many questions and not worshiping the gods the way everyone else did. He was found guilty. The punishment was death, but he could have escaped. His friends offered to help him flee, but Socrates refused. He believed in the rule of law, even if the law was wrong. So he drank a cup of hemlock and died calmly, surrounded by his students. That moment became legendary, not because of the tragedy, but because of the integrity. Socrates lived by his principles, and he died by them too. His student Plato would go on to write down many of these conversations, preserving the Socratic method for future generations. Plato. All right, so we've met Socrates, the guy who asked all the questions. Now let's talk about the guy who tried to answer them, Plato. Plato was born around 428 BCE in Athens, and he was basically a rich kid turned deep thinker. After watching his mentor Socrates get sentenced to death for asking too many questions, Plato decided the world needed some serious fixing. And he wasn't just going to complain about it, he was going to build a whole system of thought to figure out how society should work. Now, Plato wrote a lot. Unlike Socrates, we actually have his books. Well, dialogues, really. He wrote them like conversations, often starring Socrates as the main character. So when you read Plato, it's kind of like watching a philosophical play. One of Plato's big ideas was something called the theory of forms. Don't worry, it's not as abstract as it sounds. Basically, Plato believed that everything we see in the world, trees, chairs, people, is just a shadow of a perfect version that exists somewhere else. He called these perfect versions forms. So let's say a beautiful painting is just a reflection of the perfect form of beauty. A just law is a glimpse of the ideal form of justice. It's like saying the real world is a messy copy of a perfect blueprint. And according to Plato, philosophers are the ones who try to understand those blueprints. This idea shows up in one of his most famous stories, the allegory of the cave. Imagine people chained inside a cave, only able to see shadows on the wall. They think those shadows are reality. But one person escapes, sees the real world outside, and realizes the truth. That's the philosopher, someone who breaks free from illusion and sees things as they truly are. And when they come back to tell everyone else, most people don't believe them. Sound familiar? Plato also has strong opinions about politics. In his book, The Republic, he imagined a society ruled by philosopher kings, wise leaders who understand the forms and make decisions based on truth and justice, not power or popularity. He wasn't a fan of democracy as it existed in Athens, especially after what happened to Socrates. He thought most people were too distracted or uninformed to make good decisions, and that leadership should be earned through wisdom, not votes. But Plato wasn't just about lofty ideas. He founded the Academy, the first real university in the Western world. It was a place where people could study philosophy, math, and science, not for money or fame, but to understand the deeper truths of life. And guess who studied there? A guy named Aristotle. Yep, we'll get to him next. Aristotle is the guy who took Plato's ideas, gave them a reality check, and laid the groundwork for science, logic, and pretty much everything else. So let's get to it then. Aristotle. Now that we have met Socrates, the questioner, then Plato, the dreamer, now it's time for Aristotle, the realist. So Aristotle was born in 384 BCE in a place called Stagira, not Athens. His dad was a doctor for the royal family, so young Aristotle grew up around biology and medicine. That early exposure to the natural world stuck with him. Later, he moved to Athens and joined Plato's Academy, where he studied for about 20 years. But here's the twist. While he respected Plato, he didn't always agree with him. Remember Plato's idea of perfect forms? Aristotle thought, interesting, but let's get real. He believed that instead of chasing invisible ideals, we should study the actual world around us. Trees, animals, people, politics, everything. He wanted to understand how things work, not just what they should be. So Aristotle became the ultimate observer. He basically invented the scientific method before science was even a thing. He'd watch animals, dissect plants, categorize everything. He believed that knowledge starts with experience. You see something, you ask questions, you look for patterns, and only then you build theories. One of his big contributions was logic. He created a system for reasoning that's still used today. Ever heard of syllogisms? It's a way of making conclusions based on two statements, like all humans are mortal, Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal. Simple, right? But revolutionary at the time where basic thinking didn't even exist. Aristotle didn't stop at science and logic. He also dove into ethics, asking what makes a good life. His answer wasn't about following rules or chasing pleasure. He believed in something called virtue ethics. The idea that a good life comes from developing good character, things like courage, honesty, and generosity. Not too much, not too little, just the right balance. He called this the golden mean. For example, courage isn't about being reckless or cowardly. It's about finding that middle ground, being brave when it matters, but not foolish. Aristotle believed that practicing these virtues over time shapes who you are. It's not about being perfect, it's about growing. He also had a lot to say about politics. Unlike Plato, who dreamed of philosopher kings, Aristotle studied real governments and asked what actually works. He thought the best system was one that balanced power and served the common good. He wasn't obsessed with one ideal. He was more like, let's see what works in practice. And here's a fun fact. Aristotle was hired to tutor a young prince named Alexander. Yep, that Alexander, the one who became the Great. So Aristotle's ideas didn't just stay in the classroom. They traveled across empires. Epicurus. Let's take a breath. We've talked about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, big thinkers with big systems. Now, let's meet someone who took a gentler path. Epicurus. Born in 341 BCE on the island of Samos, Epicurus wasn't interested in power, politics, or abstract perfection. He wanted to answer one simple question. How can we live a happy life? And his answer? It's not what you might expect. Epicurus believed that happiness comes from pleasure, but not the wild, party all-night kind. He wasn't about indulgence or luxury. For him, pleasure meant peace, calm, freedom from pain, both physical and emotional. He called this state ataraxia, a fancy Greek word for inner tranquility. So how do you get there? So first, Epicurus said, don't fear the gods. He believed the universe was made of tiny particles, atoms, and that the gods, if they existed, weren't meddling in our lives. That was a radical idea back then. It meant people didn't have to live in fear of divine punishment or cosmic judgment. The universe runs on natural laws, not divine whims. Second, don't fear death. Epicurus argued that death is nothing to us. When we're alive, death isn't here. And when death comes, we're not around to feel it. So why waste energy worrying about something that doesn't affect us? Third, choose your desires wisely. Not all pleasures are worth chasing. Some lead to pain. Epicurus divided desires into three types: natural and necessary, like food, shelter, friendship; natural but unnecessary, like fancy meals or luxury; and vain desires, like fame or power. He said we should focus on the first group, the basics. That's where real happiness lives. And here's something beautiful. Epicurus placed a huge value on friendship. He believed that having close, trustworthy friends was one of life's greatest sources of joy. In fact, he built a community, a kind of philosophical garden where people lived simply, shared meals, and talked about life. No politics, no drama, just thoughtful living. Now, some people misunderstood Epicurus. They thought he was promoting hedonism, living for pleasure at any cost. But that's not true. He was more like a minimalist philosopher. He taught that the best life is one where you feel safe, content, and free from anxiety. Only if the world lives as the garden he made would there be so much chaos. I don't think so. Pythagoras. You've heard the name, probably from math class. That triangle thing. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Here's the twist. Pythagoras wasn't just a mathematician. He was a philosopher, a mystic, and some say a cult leader. Born around 570 BCE on the island of Samos, Pythagoras traveled widely before settling in southern Italy, where he founded a secretive school. Not just a school, a brotherhood. His followers lived by strict rules. No meat, no beans, no personal possessions. They believed that numbers weren't just tools. They were the essence of reality. Pythagoras taught that everything in the universe could be explained through numbers and harmony. He saw math not as cold calculation, but as a kind of divine language. Music, just math in motion. The planets moving in perfect ratios. He believed the cosmos itself was structured like a musical scale, what he called the music of the spheres. And yes, he's credited with the Pythagorean theorem, a way to calculate the sides of a right triangle. But for him, geometry wasn't just practical. It was sacred. Shapes had meaning. Numbers had souls. The number 1 represented unity. 2 was duality. 3 was harmony. 10, perfection. This wasn't just math, it was metaphysics. Pythagoras also believed in reincarnation. He taught that the soul is immortal and passes through many lives. That's why his followers lived so strictly. They thought purity of life led to purity of soul. Some even claimed Pythagoras could remember his past lives. Others said he had a golden thigh and could tame animals with his voice. Whether myth or truth, one thing's clear. He had serious charisma. But here's the catch. Pythagoras didn't leave behind any writings. Everything we know comes from his followers and later thinkers. That makes it hard to separate fact from legend. Was he a genius, a guru, a bit of both? What we do know is that his ideas shaped philosophy, science, and religion for centuries. He inspired Plato's obsession with geometry. He laid the groundwork for mathematical thinking, and he introduced the idea that the universe is ordered, knowable, and, at its core, beautiful. Diogenes didn't care what you thought about status, manners, wealth, or even philosophy itself. He was the guy who walked barefoot through Athens in broad daylight, holding a lantern, saying he was looking for an honest man. Spoiler, he never found one. Born around 412 BCE in Sinope, Diogenes was exiled from his hometown, allegedly for defacing currency. So he moved to Athens and decided to deface something bigger, society. He became the loudest voice in the school of cynicism, a philosophy that said civilization was a joke, and virtue was found in living naturally, free from all social conventions. And Diogenes didn't just preach it, he lived it, literally. He gave up everything. No house, no possessions, no shame. He slept in a large ceramic jar in the marketplace, ate scraps, bathed in public fountains. He once saw a child drinking water with his hands and threw away his own cup, saying, "A child has beaten me in simplicity." His philosophy was brutal. If something isn't necessary, it's a trap. Comfort is a weakness. Luxury is corruption. Reputation is a distraction. He believed that most people were slaves, not to chains, but to desires. They chased money, approval, and status. Diogenes chased freedom. And he had no patience for pretenders. When Plato defined humans as featherless bipeds, Diogenes plucked a chicken and brought it into the academy, declaring, "Behold, Plato's man." Plato later added, "with broad nails," to the definition. He mocked politicians, philosophers, and anyone who took themselves too seriously. When Alexander the Great visited him and said, "Ask anything of me," Diogenes replied, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." That's it. No bowing, no flattery, just pure defiance. But Diogenes wasn't just being rude for fun. He was making a point. He believed that truth comes from stripping away everything artificial, that virtue isn't found in books or speeches. It's found in how you live. And to live well, you have to be free. Free from fear, from greed, from shame. He practiced what he called autarka, self-sufficiency, not needing anything from anyone, not being owned by desires. He trained himself to endure hunger, cold, and insults, not because he liked suffering, but because he believed that only through detachment could you be truly human. And yes, he was extreme. He did things that made people uncomfortable. He broke taboos. He challenged norms. But that was the point. Diogenes wanted to shock people awake, to show them how absurd their lives were, how they were trapped by things they didn't even question. He didn't write books. He didn't build schools. He lived his philosophy in the streets, in the dirt, in the rawness of everyday life. And people remembered, not because he was polite, but because he was uncompromising. Diogenes was the philosopher who refused to play the game. He didn't want to win. He wanted to flip the board. And in doing so, he forced everyone else to ask, what am I really chasing? So this was all from the Greek philosophers. Today, such thoughts and theories may seem very normal because these people started a long time ago. Else, instead of working on greater things, we'd be stuck on the basics too. Thanks for watching this video.